So I know I'm going back and forth between Iran and Iraq, but I just want to impress upon you that this is one of the uncontroversial war crimes in all of human history, certainly in the lifetime of many of the people in this room, and absolutely deserves some kind of accountability. Someone has to pay for the crimes of invasion. Literally with jail sentences, because every single one of these guys that was involved, and women that were involved in the planning and waging of this war against a country not threatening the United States, and who are now planning another war against a country not threatening the United States, should be held accountable. And also we should be talking about reparations to the Iraqi people for the enormous destruction that the American military invasion and occupation has caused in Iraq. Iraq is a failed state, but I don't say that in the passive voice, because that's how the Fund for Peace described it. It listed Iraq as a failed state, like, you know, it rained, people died. It was a tragedy. There was a car accident. There's no agency. How did Iraq become a failed state? Because of the U.S. invasion, cause and effect. And so that's why I'm, you know, at every opportunity, you know, I want to, you know, talk about this particular issue of reparations, war crimes, and accountability. And just one more thing on Iraq before I focus more on Iran. There was this dog and pony show on, curiously, September 11th in Washington. You remember when General David Petraeus and Ryan Crocker, who's our, the viceroy of Iraq, also called the U.S. ambassador, and Petraeus is the, the commander of the so-called coalition, which is a joke. We're talking about a few Lithuanians, Armenians, Georgians, Latvians. The British have completely withdrawn to a base outside of Basra. They don't dare come out, and they're paring down their troops. Australia still has a force in Iraq, but all the signs point to John Howard being defeated next month in Australia, and those troops will be withdrawn. So every time, those words, coalition forces, come out of these guys' mouth, I just wince. Yeah, right. Real coalition. The U.S. is calling all the shots. You should completely, disabuse yourself of anything else. That's the reality of what's going on. So you had this dog and pony show going on, and Petraeus is, they're talking now Anbar province. This is the model. This is the success. This is what we should be doing. We're finally getting it right. And first we learn that the Sunni tribal sheikhs, in almost a replication of what the British did in 1920 when they took over Iraq from the Turks, they cemented alliances with various clan chieftains. And these Sunni tribal sheikhs in northwestern Iraq, which is a huge landmass, by the way, it's very, very large, they were formerly killing Americans. And now they apparently have been persuaded about the genius of democracy and God, because God is speaking through Bush and Bush speaks to us. They have seen the light about liberty and freedom, and now they're supporting the Americans. Now you may think, well, this is a remarkable conversion here. What did Petraeus leave out of this particular story? One slight fact. Can you see this? It's a wad of, well, I wish it were $100 bills. It's a wad of $1 bills. These guys were all paid off. They were all bribed. And that's how they, they have now become fair weather friends of the Americans. Another thing that the dear general left out is that the province was ethnically cleansed of all Shias. And the third thing, which is perhaps the most important of all, is that it only contains about 2 or 3% of the entire Iraqi population. There's hardly anyone that lives there. And so to use this as the model is completely false. Nevertheless, the great leader flies to Anbar province in early September in the middle of the night, and no one knows about it because obviously Iraq is such a success story and there are no security problems. And he has the troops hoo-haing and, these kinds of what I call electronic Nuremberg rallies. A whole series of them were held before present and former military personnel. The first one is with the Veterans for Foreign Wars. Then that was followed by the American Legion. Then it was, he went to the Quantico base in Virginia. And if you want to understand how this really works, I commend to you the wonderful documentary by the German filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl called Triumph of the Will. How to orchestrate a kind of electronic Nuremberg. This literally was a Nuremberg rally, not ersatz or faux. It is a documentary on the 1934 Nazi Party rally in Germany. And it's very, very effective use of cameras and angles and music, and very imaginative. It was a revolutionary work in terms of cinematography and conception. Today, she is routinely dismissed as, Hitler sympathizer and as a Nazi fellow traveler and the like, but an impressive work. And you see how people are manipulated with the flags, the trumpets, the torchlight parades, and very handsome men and women who apparently have no body fat, no acne, have perfect hair, are well-toned and muscled, like us. And the joke is made, by the end of the film, you're ready to join the Nazi party. I mean, this looks like wonderful. These people are like so healthy and heroic, and they want to help their country, and they want to defend themselves against, the Red Menace, the Red Tide coming from the East, and on and on. And so these kind of electronic Nuremberg rallies have been orchestrated to whip up a frenzy to defend ourselves against Iran, this huge military juggernaut that, as I described, is right off Vashon Island as we speak. In fact, I've seen the, we're laughing, but I've actually seen the Iranian Navy. And, I was trembling. The kayaks, the rowboats, the refurbished yachts, the diesel submarines, which they got from the old Soviet Union, that are so loud that if one was in fact off of Bainbridge Island or in the Puget Sound, we wouldn't even need a sonar here. We could hear it. That's how loud they are. That's the extent of the Iranian Navy. But of course, the United States has 3 aircraft carrier battle groups positioned right off the Iranian coast. So imagine again, if Iran, which doesn't have a navy, positioned its armadas off of Puget Sound or New York Harbor, what the response might be. And you remember I said the United States spends $750 million a year, $750 billion a year on the military. Do you know how much Iran spends, the Iranian military budget? The high-end figure. I'm not going to give you the low-end figure. Let's err on the high-end figure. $5 billion. That's what Iran spends on its military. How much is $5 billion? I mean, it's not chump change, but it's 1 week that we spend in Iraq. 1 week. It's 2 B-2 bombers. The U.S. military war budget of $750 million is more than all the militaries in the world combined spend on the military. And we're not talking about Sierra Leone. We're talking about serious, large countries like Russia, India, France, Britain, Italy, Germany, Japan, China, etc. So you see, if you know these things, you see, wait a second, how could Iran be a threat? They've never aggressed against, anyone in the last 250 years. They've made no threatening comments about the United States. They have said, if, we are attacked, we will defend our country, as anyone would. So why should we be led down this primrose path again of war? At one of these talks that Bush gave that I referred to, of course, he started right off with the whopper. Coalition forces seized rockets that had been manufactured in Iran. The attacks on our bases and our troops by Iranian-supplied munitions have increased. I have ordered my commanders to confront Tehran's murderous activities in Iraq. Well, that was a relief. I was, when they keep saying that, Iran is interfering in Iraq, a country with which it shares a long border, long civilizational ties. At any given time, there are hundreds of thousands of Iranians inside of Iraq because the two most important shrines for Shias, not just Iranian Shias, Shias are 90% of the population, Muslim population of Iran. Those shrines are not in Saudi Arabia. They are in Iraq. The shrine of Imam Ali at Najaf and Imam Hussein at Karbala. And it's the dream of many Iranian Shias and Lebanese Shias I've met, Turkish Shias, to go to Iraq and to perform the pilgrimage there. So there are very close ties between Iran and Iraq. In fact, the chief Ayatollah that you hear somewhat about, his name is Ali Sistani, is actually Iranian. So there's, there are very close connections between these two countries. And Iran historically had ruled, when there was the Persian Empire, Mesopotamia was under Iran, Persian, at that time called Persian, Iranian control. So there's been just a long civilizational contact there. And so it's, there are national interests for Iran in its neighboring country. Yet the U.S. is talking about, Iran is interfering in Iraq. Iran is meddling in the internal affairs of Iraq. What is the dispatch of 180,000 troops and 170 to 180,000 mercenary contractors to Iraq? Can that be classified as meddling and interfering in Iraqi, no one points out these contradictions. It's so blatant, it's so transparent, and it's astonishing. I mean, Orwell must be flipping in his grave, at these kinds of propaganda stunts that the media engage in and don't report on. You hear a lot about, let's just give you another example. Iran, should not be developing nuclear energy. It should not be enriching uranium. Why? Because Iran has plenty of oil. Why does it need to develop this alternative source of energy? Well, in the United States of amnesia, where we all live, the USA, there's no memory. As I said, educational system doesn't educate, media doesn't inform. You could go back to 1974, as I do in both these books talking about Iran, and notice that the Shah, who was our favorite leader and representative in the Middle East, told Washington, he said, oil is a finite resource. Sooner or later, it's going to end. I have to think about the future energy needs of my Iranian people. Therefore, I wish to develop, alternative sources of energy. And Kissinger is the Secretary of State, Gerald Ford is the president, and they say, "Great Shah, you are a genius. Shahan Shah, Mr. Shah, Shah Sahib, whatever they call him, Master Shah, Monsieur Shah, Shahan Shah, yeah, Emperor of Emperors." You are a sagacious, wise man. You are thinking about the future of your country. You have recognized that oil is a finite resource. Let us sell you GE reactors. And we will sell you. And they did. They sold them 6 reactors. Now, 30 years later, when another Iranian leader, who of course is not in favor in Washington, makes the exact same comment that oil is rapidly depleted. Now 30 years have passed. It's even more depleted than it was in '74 when the Shah made this announcement. Then the U.S. says that this can't be. They've got all this oil. In fact, that's what Kissinger told the great Charlie Rose, who didn't challenge him on this particular question. He said, look, they've got all this oil. It's obviously, this is a ruse. It's a ploy to develop nuclear weapons. Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as is the United States. Israel, Pakistan, and India, all armed to the teeth, are not signatories and are therefore not subject to any of the requirements of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. If we had a media that reported, we would know that the United States itself is in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, because one of the conditions of the signatories is that those states that have weapons of mass destruction are required to pare down their arsenals. That's not what's happening. They're increasing their arsenals. They're expanding into a new generation of nukes, these so-called smart nukes, leaner, faster, etc. No discussion of that in the media as well. And then you have, I was in Detroit recently. This is the classic conundrum that is facing America today on Iran. Sanctions or war. That's it. Those are your choices. Discussions, negotiations, sit down, talk over different, that's not on, in the realm of possibility. So pick your poison, sanctions or war. Every Iranian I spoke to when I was there, official and unofficial, said they want relations with the United States. They recognize certain realities in terms of military disparities and the like. They know geography. They see American troops on their eastern border in Afghanistan. They see American troops on their western border in Iraq. They look at the Persian Gulf, which should be renamed a Great Lake of the United States. It's full of American armadas. And when I say aircraft carrier battle groups, it's not just an aircraft carrier, right? It's cruisers, destroyers, submarines, minesweepers, Marine Corps battalions, helicopter gunships, F-16s, all kinds of weaponry. So it's an armada. And one of the ironies here, to connect some history, one of the battle groups is called the Eisenhower Aircraft Carrier Battle Group. So now we go a little bit full circle. Remember Eisenhower, 1961 military-industrial complex? Eisenhower, 1953, President of the United States, launches a CIA coup in Iran called Operation Ajax, which destroys Iranian democracy and restores the Shah to power. This is one of the seminal events, not just in Iranian history, but in all of Middle Eastern history. When I was lecturing in Lebanon and Syria a couple of years ago, and I was talking about this, thinking, well, they probably have heard about it, somewhere on the periphery. I was just like so overwhelmed by the level of knowledge and detail that people in those countries had about this particular coup, because this was the template. This was the first CIA operation in which they overthrew a government. Many more were to follow. In fact, in the very next year, another popular democracy was crushed in Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz, with many of the very same tactics. The coup was run by Kermit Roosevelt, the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. It was conducted out of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Let me tell you just very briefly, for the Iranian brothers and sisters here, they know the history, but who is Mohammad Mossadegh? Very interesting man. You would describe him as a kind of centrist, a moderate liberal, a kind of a lowercase Democrat, who was a nationalist. And if you would have gone to Iran in 1946, 47, 48, you would have found one of the most impoverished countries on earth. People living in mud huts, no facilities whatsoever, running water, electricity, healthcare, none, schools, none, roads, none, no facilities, nothing. Extremely, extremely poverty-stricken. Meanwhile, Iran has one of the greatest caches of oil in the world. But there's a slight problem. It's completely controlled by a Western oil corporation. In fact, the forerunner of today, that great environmental corporation, British Petroleum. 100% of the profits from Iranian oil were being repatriated out of the country. They were going to banks in London and New York. And Mossadegh, I have to confess that he was enormously disadvantaged in one respect. He was educated in France, at the Sorbonne, only the premier university, not only in France, but probably in Europe. So he didn't have the benefits of Harvard or Yale or Princeton or Cal or UW, some of our great institutions of lower education, as I call them. They get way too much credit. And Mossadegh thought, well, this is not just. This scenario is not just. He was also a very naive man. He actually believed that the Americans were different from the British and the French and the Russians, the empires of his generation. He thought that the Americans were really about liberty and democracy and freedom. And there's a very famous photograph of him. It's heartbreaking, actually, his naivete. He visited the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, and there's a famous photograph of him looking up at it. And he's like a child, in the presence of Madonna or some, super icon like that. There's just such awe and reverence in his eyes. And so he thought that he also did not understand what Kissinger would call realpolitik. That is, what's yours is mine, what's mine is mine. The fact that you have resources in your country is just an accident of geography. That oil belongs to us. In fact, George Kennan, one of these liberal State Department icons in the post-World War II, actually refers to our oil, the oil in the Middle East, as our oil. This was the organizing principle of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East in the post-1945 era. There's a State Department document. So it isn't about pomegranates and watermelons. That was just a joke, in case any of you believe me. And I know. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but it is about oil. The State Department issues a document saying that the oil of the Middle East constitute the greatest strategic prize in the history of the world. And this becomes the focus, the obsession of U.S. policymakers, how to grab the oil. And there were a few problems. One is the presence of the old European empires, the French, who were already kind of marginalized because they were in Lebanon and Syria, where there was no oil to speak of. But it was the British that were still there, and the sun still had not set on the British Empire yet. As Tariq Ali tells the joke, the reason the sun never set on the British Empire is that God didn't trust them in the dark. So he constantly had to have a light on them. I'm glad you're laughing. It's really good to, everyone, of course, will be paid off who have been laughing at my jokes. It's much appreciated. And the British controlled Iraq. It was a de facto colony. They actually had Kuwait. It was a de jure colony, part of the British Empire. And they were in Iran significantly. So the CIA coup that Eisenhower okays serves two purposes. Not only does it destroy democracy in Iran, it has the demonstration effect of showing the rest of the world, look out. If you think about nationalizing your resources, these are the consequences. The other benefit for Washington was it edged out the British from Iran. Now you have the introduction of American power in one of the most strategic countries in the Middle East. And as I said, the embassy was the locus of the coup there. There was black propaganda planted in the Iranian media. Classic case. We see it over and over again in Panama, in Chile, in Guatemala, in the Dominican Republic, in Brazil, wherever there have been CIA coups, in Venezuela in 2002, same kind of black propaganda. In this case with Mossadegh, he was actually a communist. That's what the Americans were telling the Iranians, that you would not be able to practice Islam. You'd have to learn Russian. Iran would become a colony of the Soviet Union, and that kind of thing. And then payoffs, again, it's always handy to have wads of $100 bills when you're conducting foreign policy. Payoffs to Iranian military officers to participate in the coup. And so the coup takes place. Mossadegh is overwhelmed. He doesn't have a chance. He's put under house arrest. The Shah, who is in exile in Rome, is flown back on a CIA plane to Tehran and resumes, sitting on the peacock throne in Iran. And, again, actions have consequences. And even the CIA had a hint that this could have some negative repercussions in the future. Every time they conduct an operation, they have a post-ops report. It reads like a sports report. Should have done this. This pinch hitter would have been terrific in the 8th inning. Why was he used in the 3rd inning? We should have brought this reliever in to, replace the starting pitcher. All of those kinds of, considerations. Good things, bad things. And then, interestingly, they use the term blowback for the first time. It's the first time this term is ever used. It means the unintended consequences of U.S. foreign policy. And so the blowback that was predicted or mentioned in the CIA report was that somewhere down the line, this could have very negative ramifications. And of course, it was prescient. It did have negative ramifications because after almost 2.5 decades of the Shah's rule, and basically he was the American puppet there, buying billions of dollars in gold-plated weaponry, F-4s and other gold-plated weapons that he could never use. The Shah is overthrown in the Islamic Revolution of 1979. So we see again, time and again, actions have consequences. U.S. goes into Iraq, shock and awe, mission accomplished, sweets and flowers, liberation, cakewalk, all of that. Well, what has happened to Iraq? The destruction of a country, and whether it will be able to reconstitute itself again is problematic. I mean, that is the level of carnage and mayhem inside of Iraq today. So actions have consequences. The Saudis and the Americans support the most extreme fundamentalist elements in the Islamic world, bring them to Pakistan, to the training camps along the frontier, train them, they become the mujahideen, who Reagan called freedom fighters and compared to the founding fathers. And who did they become after they drive out the Soviet Union? Many of them morphed into the Taliban and into Al-Qaeda. Actions have consequences. And an attack on Iran will have enormous consequences. Iran is not some Grenada or Panama or some banana republic that could just be whisked away by shock and awe. For those of you who know anything about Iran and its culture and history, one thing that has always struck me is a strong sense of Iranianness among Iranians, like Iraniyat. It's like there's a tremendous pride in the culture, in the civilization. They're very quick to tell you, we are not Arabs. We don't speak Arabic. Yes, our Farsi is written in Arabic, but it is our language. It's an Indo-European language. It's closer to Urdu and Pashto and Dari and Bangla and other Hindi and languages like that. It has very little connection to Arabic, except for the religious Quranic terminology, which is borrowed, of course. But the Iranians added 4 letters to the Arabic alphabet of 28 to accommodate their own sounds, like the j in Ahmadinejad. That's an Iranian sound. And they're very proud of their history and their culture. This year, we're celebrating, the world is celebrating the 800th birthday of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, the great Sufi poet. He wrote in Farsi. He was born in the Persian Empire in what is today Balkh. That's in Afghanistan in the north. But he's considered, part of the great Iranian literary tradition. And it's not just Rumi. You should know that there's Ferdowsi and Jami, Attar, Nizami, Hafiz, Sadi, a whole host of great, great poets, right down to the current period. A couple of years ago, the greatest contemporary Iranian poet, and we talk about him in the chapter with Nahid Mozaffari, this wonderful woman, Iranian woman that I have in the book here on Iranian culture. The greatest contemporary, most popular Iranian poet dies. His name is Ahmad Shamlou. 100,000 Iranians turned out at his funeral to bid him farewell. You know, when Allen Ginsberg, who I had the privilege of knowing, he'd been in Boulder for many years at the Naropa Institute, when he died in 1997, I think something like 80 or 90 people turned out for his, to say goodbye to him. And people were impressed. Wow, 80, 90 people, this is quite something. But you see the place that the oral tradition, that poetry has in the Iranian imagination. And every Iranian that I spoke to said that any US attack is going to solidify support for the regime in Tehran. The regime of Ahmadinejad, who is not particularly popular, by the way, recently in municipal elections in Iran, every single candidate associated with him was defeated. There's an enormous amount of opposition to him. He has been literally run off two major campuses, Amir Kabir in Tehran University, and most recently the Danishgah Tehran, the University of Tehran. He barely could get out of his car when students accosted him, calling him a fascist and a dictator, and we want our freedom. And I was talking to some students when I was there, and they were very bitter because many of them have to leave the country to find work. Because there's an enormous amount of unemployment. And the destination is the Gulf. That's where there's work, in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and the Emirates. And they told me, we don't need Holocaust conferences, we need jobs. And in reference to this Holocaust conference that Ahmadinejad hosted in Tehran in December, inviting such notorious cranks as David Duke from the United States and Robert Faurisson from France. I mean, this was a disaster. I mean, not only was it a moral disaster to host such a conference, to have the Iranian government pay for these people, to put them up in discomfort and shame. Why do we have to do that? It was a stupid thing to do. We have so many problems. Why are we, focusing on this kind of issue? So it had been he's very, very unpopular, but he's not the final say in Iran. And this was something that the media completely missed when he was in New York the week of September 24th to address the United States nations when, the New York Post headline was "The madman has landed," and the Daily News said "The evil is here," and then the Columbia University president, he was very virtuous in denouncing Ahmadinejad, a very easy thing to do, primarily to placate his alumni who are paying his salary and who threatened some kind of retribution because they were very unhappy that Columbia had given the Iranian president a forum to speak in New York. And so the real power in Iran is held by the Rehbar, the supreme leader, the Ayatollah, in this case, Ali Khamenei. And he has final say on all important domestic and international issues. Iran is not a banana republic. It will fight back. It can inflict quite a bit of damage on the United States. It has surface-to-surface missiles that can attack the U.S. fleets in the Gulf. It has allies in Afghanistan where half the population speaks Farsi. It has major allies in Iraq, not just its Shia co-brethren, who are about 65% of the Iraqi population, but practically the entire political leadership in Iraq today owes its allegiance to Tehran. That's where they were, they went for safe haven. When Saddam Hussein attacked Iran in September of 1980, when the United States and the so-called international community had nothing to say about international law, had nothing to say about the violation of the sovereignty of a member state of the United Nations, had nothing to say about Nuremberg principles and of aggression, etc. The Iranians noted this, by the way. They also noted the silence from Washington when Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons on Iranian troops, and Iran did not retaliate with biological and chemical weapons, which it had and could have used in its defense. It heard the silence. It was deafening. It heard the silence in July of 1988 when a U.S. warship in the Persian Gulf blows up an Iranian jetliner flying in international airspace. killing 290 Iranians. You know, it's always good to have controls, and you remember 5 years before that to compare things. You have, you know, some like textbook examples. 5 years before that, you remember the horrible Soviet Union shot down the Korean airliner, and Reagan was going on and on. You know, this shows Moscow's perfidy. This shows their evilness and how barbaric they are, and they just kill innocent women and children. There's some evidence that that plane was in Soviet airspace. That still, it's inexcusable that it was shot down. What was the response in 1988 when this US warship shoots an Iranian airliner out of the sky, killing 290 Iranians? Well, you probably think, you know, the commander must have been court-martialed. He was probably demoted, maybe even served some jail time. You know, that would be interesting. No, au contraire. He got a medal when he returned back to the United States. In 1992, when Bush père, you know, George Herbert Walker Bush was running for re-election, someone on the campaign trail, I don't know, this was obviously some loose cannon, asked him about the Vincennes, and you know that there's evidence that this was a civilian aircraft. It was flying in international airspace. It was nowhere near the US warship on routine naval patrols in the Persian Gulf. We are the only country in the world that conducts routine naval patrols in other people's airspace for the Air Force and seascape. Imagine if the Iranian Navy or the Afghan Navy or the Armenian Navy came to Puget Sound and said they were conducting routine naval patrols. We Armenians, we want to understand the currents of Puget Sound and feel the salt water and see the Seattle skyline so our people can have a better understanding of America and this region. Again, you're laughing, but you can imagine what the response would be. There was a ship, another US ship right next to the Vincennes when this was going on, and the captain noticed that the Vincennes, this is the US destroyer that launches an Aegis cruise destroyer, launches the missiles. The captain of the other ship says, something's going on here. You know, they've locked on to a civilian airliner. It was very clear to him it was a civilian airliner. And, you know, what is he doing? And before anything, you know, can I get him on the phone or, you know, you send him an email or something? There was no email then. Before he could do anything, the plane was shot out of the sky. In 1992, Bush is on the campaign trail, and some reporter, really intemperate, I must say, said that, you know, brought up this whole issue of what happened to the Iranian Airbus. And it looks like, you know, they weren't doing anything. They were a threat to no one. What happened here? His exact words, which any Iranian can quote you, is, "I don't care what the facts are. I will never apologize for the United States of America." You know, people have feelings, believe it or not. You know, even Iranians, even Iraqis, they care about things like that. And when they hear things, that kind of arrogant, hubristic, imperial statements, you know, it really affects them, understandably so. Now I just want to finally, that's an applause line, folks. Yeah, you know, in other, I don't want to like, in other audiences, people, you know, they get on their feet, it's a standing ovation, right? And you hear the gasp, you know, it's great for radio, gasp. Woo, finally, that Woody Allen wannabe, I thought he'd never finish. God, he just goes on and on, you know, just another smart-ass New Yorker, you know, thinks he knows all the answers. Damn, woo. I want to talk a little bit about Shirin Ebadi, who was referred to by a member of the audience a little earlier. She won the 2003 Nobel Peace Prize. You know, a very distinguished lawyer, judge, human rights activist. She lost her job under the Islamic regime of Iran, under this administration, not the previous administration of Mohammad Khatami. And I had the opportunity to talk to her, and so this is in the introduction that I wrote for the book. She told me that the Iranian people are exceedingly proud of their long history and culture. And this is a really interesting comment because it really shows her time frame and what she thinks about the Islamic Republic. She says, Iran as a country is larger and greater than its rulers and exists apart from any government in power at any particular time. But then she warns, if America attacks, however, Iranians will unite, forgetting their differences with their government, and they will fiercely and tenaciously defend their country. I was just reading almost verbatim the exact same words from the journalist Akbar Ganji, who has spent a number of years in Iranian jails because of his political opposition to the regime. There is a democracy movement in Iran. There is a feminist movement in Iran. There's, as I said, women are highly educated. They're highly motivated. They're in most of the technical professions, but they're also in the film industry. Iran, it's worth saying, has one of the most sophisticated film industries in the world. Extraordinary for a country of 70 million people. Some fantastic filmmakers. You can get many of these films, Majidi and Mokhlabaf and Kiarostami and Panahi Ghobbadi. There's a whole range of them. Marvelous, marvelous filmmakers, cultural and of enormous, I would say, subtlety and accomplishment, because they have a very narrow line that they have to walk. They have to be exceedingly careful what they say, about sexuality or justice or freedom or democracy. So everything is double entendre. Almost everything has double meanings, and that's how they navigate those kinds of restrictions and constraints. And then Ebadi, I also met her in Denver when she visited. And she said on that occasion, democracy cannot be brought to a people with cluster bombs. Seems obvious. Democracy cannot be delivered from the bomb bay doors of a B-52 or out of a helicopter gunship or from F-16s. It has to be something organic. It has to come up from the soil of the people. It cannot be imposed, particularly from mostly white, mostly Christian people living 12,000 miles away who know nothing about Iran, who know nothing about Iranian culture and history, or the Middle East for that matter. Every Iranian talks about this. And she says, any military invasion or even the threat of one harms democracy. It is not something that happens overnight. Democracy needs to evolve in a peaceful atmosphere. And the United States, she warns, must not impose it on Iran or any other country. It will be a disaster if it tries. And I noticed when she was telling me this, she was in acute physical discomfort. And I said, can I get you some water? Are you okay? And she said, I have terrible sciatica. And I said, well, what do you do? What kind of, medication? How do you relieve that pain and discomfort? She says, I read Persian poetry. I learned this, I made a fool of myself in Iran on many occasions, incidentally, but on this particular one, I happened to ask an Iranian if he liked poetry. And if any of you know anything about, as I said, Iranian culture, it's like asking someone, do you like fresh air? Do you like to breathe? I really like, that one was really bad. And so I said, well, what poetry do you read? And can you recite a particular poem that you like? She said, I really like Hafiz Shirazi, one of these great Sufi masters. And she told me this particular poem. If there is no justice, then those who are deprived may one day take to the streets and rise up. If there is no justice, then those who are deprived may one day take to the streets and rise up. We could apply that right here to the United States, where there is less and less justice, where there is more and more militarization, where there is more and more invasions of privacy and undermining of our basic human and constitutional rights. We should think about that. We should think about and demand that all U.S. troops be withdrawn from Afghanistan and Iraq, not next year, not the year after, not in 2030, but right now, and no attack on Iran. Thank you very much. you. Mutashakaram, merci, kheli mamnoon, thank you very much. Those were my opening remarks. I have a prepared speech. I worked on it all last night for hours. How are we doing on time? Okay, we're going to have to forego my formal presentation then, and maybe go right into the Q&A. I believe there are microphones here. Our wonderful friend Ed Mays is here from Seattle, who does a terrific public service in filming a lot of events and then presenting them on cable access. Thank you, Ed, and to KEXP for recording and KUOW as well. The light is kind of in my face, but yes, ma'am. Well, I think they want, I get your drift. They want to win the White House. And they think that if they introduce articles of impeachment, and they don't have the votes, you know, in the Senate to get a conviction. They may have the votes in the House, quite conceivably. But they certainly don't have the necessary number in the Senate. I feel it's a totally opportunistic thing that they're doing, that they have surrendered principle to the altar of, you know, gaining the White House in 2008. You know, there have been comments that, you know, impeachment would be very messy. It would divide the country. The country is not only divided, it's quartered an eighth. That's how divided the country is. And there's an enormous amount of sentiment, incidentally, for impeachment, as the sister mentioned. 54% of Americans consider Cheney impeachable. That's 8% more than Bush. Now, it's interesting. Why is this interesting, this figure? Because it's not being discussed anywhere. How are people reaching that, I think, astute conclusion if it's not part of the discourse, if it's not part of the, you know, the Supersonics post-game show, and why did they trade Ray Allen? How did this come into the kind of, you know, the collective consciousness? I think, you know, people have figured out for themselves, but the Democrats, you know, if JFK, you know, one of their idols, if he were alive today, he'd write a book called Profiles in Cowardice. You know, he wrote a famous book when he was a senator from Massachusetts called Profiles in Courage. But I think this is an important moral issue, and I think you should put pressure on McDermott and Conyers, who is the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, who is empowered legally to introduce articles of impeachment. And he indicated that he would do that or consider that before the Democrats, you know, took over in November of '06. And obviously somebody got to him and said, you know, cool it. Let's not go there. I think we need to go there. I think it's morally imperative that we do, and I cannot stress that you know, more emphatically. Did you see the Bill Moyers Journal program a couple of months ago? It's the only thing worth watching on PBS practically. He had a program on with Bruce Fein, who is a Reaganite Justice Department official, very conservative, straight-laced Republican to the core, and John Nichols of The Nation magazine, you know, who you would expect to be for impeachment. In fact, Fein was just simply out-eloquent and out-articulated even Nichols, and made a very forceful case for impeachment, you know, reading the letter of the law, right down the list of war crimes, international as well as national. There was such a response to this program that apparently for the first time in Moyers' some 30-odd years in public broadcasting, he repeated it within 3 or 4 weeks. So maybe some of you saw the second edition of that. The entire text is at pbs.org. You can read it for yourselves. So it shows that there is, I think, quite a bit of sentiment in the country for justice, because this is an issue of justice. It's for the Iraqi people, it's for the Afghan people, it's for the Palestinians, it's for, you know, all of the oppressed people in the world, and it is also for us. It is for our moral well-being.
my friend?
The answer is very clearly, I think, this is payback for 1979. The United States has never accepted the Islamic Revolution and the overthrow of the Shah, who was their golden boy. He was their ATM machine. As long as he was in Tehran, you know, he was cranking out billions of dollars that were flowing into the coffers of these military-industrial contractors. And so it was a huge blow to American hegemony. You know, what we say goes. What's yours is mine. What's mine is mine. But really, this addresses a fundamental issue of all U.S. foreign policy, particularly since the end of World War II. As Arundhati Roy once told me, it's very dangerous to be a tall poppy. It's very dangerous to stand out in that field. You want to be invisible. You want to be below the flower line, because if you stand up and the hegemon sees you, he'll cut you down. That's why they have to stop Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. That's why they loathe him, because he stands up and says, we're different. We don't want to be part of the American empire. We want to do things our way. Maybe it's wrong, but it's ours. That's why they loathe Evo Morales in Bolivia. That's why they despise Correa, Rafael Correa in Ecuador and Cuba, and right down through all of the, you know, the history, Allende in Chile and Arbenz and Mossadegh and Bash in the Dominican Republic. Anyone who stands up, Nasser in Egypt, and defies the Godfather is in for extreme retaliation and retribution. And it's a good, maybe we can actually close with this, because I just noticed it's gotten very, very late, and I do want to sign some, you know, Targeting Iran and What We Say Goes books. But if you really want to understand how United States policy actually works internationally, I think the Godfather model is the one to grasp. You know, you don't have to go to UW to figure this out and to study political science or history for years and years. Or you can just watch 10 minutes of any episode of The Sopranos. As long as you are loyal to the master, to the Godfather, as long as you kiss his hand, genuflect before him, touch his feet, you'll be well looked after and tended to. You'll be honored. You'll be protected. You'll be part of the family. You'll get, you know, you'll get a strawberry cheesecake on your birthday. You'll get flowers on your wedding anniversary. You'll get checks in the mail for your son's tuition or daughter's tuition or whatever. But the moment you break out and say, I want to start my own family. I want to be a godfather too. I'm smart. I got connections. I know people in Jersey. I know people in Brooklyn. I can, you know, I can get going here. Why should I give all my loyalty to this guy? I'm smarter than he is, and I'm 30 years younger. You know, give me an opportunity. That can't be tolerated. And so the threat of independent nationalism is really what animates a lot of US foreign policy, not just the oil and the resources, but the idea of a successful model. Why did you think they went after the Nicaraguans the way they did? Because they thought the Sandinistas were going to conquer America? Because they were worried about the Sandinista Navy and, you know, Panzer divisions and Luftwaffe, you know, conquering? Of course not. I mean, if you said that to anyone, they'd start laughing. It is about the threat of a successful example. That's why they went after the FMLN in Salvador as well. See, the empire is extremely intolerant. It doesn't have a philosophy of, you know, Leben and Leben lassen, you know, live and let live. It's live or die. It's not, it has none of the let live, you know, really feeling. It wants to control, it wants to dominate. And that we have to come to terms with that. We have to come to terms with who we are as a people and what we're doing in the world, not the fantasy stories, not the fairy tales about golden slippers. And I think that's incumbent on us all. So I'd be happy to talk to you further over here and sign some books. Thanks again to Elliott Bay and all of you for coming. Thank you very much.